And I loved what Yoshi said. It's maybe a wild dream to have, but there might be a moment where somebody is asking you for a wild dream. Thank you very much, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I start my speech with an apology because I prepared for something entirely else. We had discussed the geopolitics of food, but hearing this discussion, maybe I start with the humanitarian situation, and then, since I heard so many visionary speeches this afternoon, I can maybe provide a bit of a vision, maybe even an unrealistic one, but I would dare say a beautiful one. Well, the humanitarian situation in Gaza, I don't need to explain to you. It has been, over the last 15 months, one of the worst situations, and indeed, you know, there are certain words you don't use in my world. One of them is starvation, and we've been edging around using that word or not using that, but indeed we had a situation before the ceasefire started where we had indeed 96% of the population of Gaza in food insecurity and in absolute poverty. Now, in the last 42 days, we had the chance to finally have the borders open and bring in massive amounts of support. And I dare say we haven't wasted a minute, brought in together with UNRWA 60,000 tons of food. And as the gates are now closed, at least we are good for the next 2 weeks. The bakeries may be good for the next 4 weeks, but we all know how fast this time is passing. We've been pushing consistently for open borders, humanitarian access, but it is very clear that you cannot feed more than 2 million people on humanitarian aid forever. We need commerce again, we need commercial transactions, we need trading in food. The situation is such that we are afraid to lose children for malnutrition, to have situations in which disability might be a consequence of malnutrition. This is absolutely unacceptable. And now I'm touching upon something that I initially wanted to talk about, which is the geopolitics of food. Because the Middle East, or the Near East, if I'm using your words, is one of the most fragile regions in the world when it comes to food security. No other place is importing so much grain. No other place is so vulnerable and so dependent from imports. Where do these imports come from? Well, guess what? A lion's share of it comes from Ukraine. And if a region in the world has felt the punch of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, then it's exactly that region of the world, on top of COVID. Let me remind you, globally, as WFP, we estimate that around Christmas 2019, we had 135 million people in acute food insecurity, people who do need humanitarian aid to survive. Today, this number is 340 million. And of course, the biggest driver is conflict. The driver in Gaza is, of course, conflict. The driver in Sudan is conflict. But we must not forget that there is a background noise of global food insecurity that's becoming worse all the time. Because these 340 million people I'm talking about are in 74 countries of the world. Now, talking about vulnerabilities, we stopped, much to my dismay, talking about climate change. It is as it's disappeared from the political screen. But climate change is real. It will continue to impact us. And now we have a region of the world that is already so vulnerable because it is so dependent to food imports. Egypt, 86% of the food being imported. You put additional pressure from climate change on it. Think about that 60% of our calories worldwide are produced by only 3 different crops, which in return are being produced by 5 major producing countries. Now, if you had failure of a harvest in one of these countries, you have a situation similarly to the Ukraine crisis, with Ukraine only being the 5th largest provider of wheat. Now, if you have a combined crisis because of climate, of misharvests in one or two of those countries, you will see food prices going through the roof, and you will see the biggest impact of it in particularly the MENA region again. Now, I promise to conclude, and I'm doing that with a bit of a vision that you would say is maybe completely out of the charts. But one of the things that keep me busy since many years is the sheer fact that we have more than 50% of global agricultural land degraded, in a state of degradation. Now, what has that to do with Israel and Palestine and the MENA region? If we are in a situation where food production and food supply becomes more and more of an issue, which we have to learn because we come out of happy 30 years in which food prices were ridiculously low and we didn't even think about where our food is coming from, we need to bring back arable land in areas where it's particularly fragile, mostly in the Sahelian countries where my organization works to restore land. But here comes the idea, what if land restoration, Israeli technology, drip irrigation, Palestinian culture and tradition, olive trees and so on, comes together in actually bringing agricultural land back into use in a joint effort, combating a joint enemy, which is food insecurity and the impacts of climate change. And I loved what Yoshi said. It's maybe a wild dream to have, but there might be a moment where somebody is asking you for a wild dream. So working together, restoring food security, bringing biblical land back into agricultural use might be an element of a long-term peace perspective. And if this was too wild out, I beg your pardon, but I thought this is a moment also not only to state how horrible the humanitarian situation is, but what actually could be happening in the land across the Jordan. Thank you very much indeed.